Breakdown by Chris Harvey. It was the situation that would frighten anyone, the nightmare scenario that everyone dreaded. But for Jane Macmillan, the scenario seemed particularly disturbing. It had happened shortly after midnight. She had been driving for some time and had found herself heading deeper into the countryside, accelerating along various country lanes. She was losing her bearings, losing all sense of direction, and panic was beginning to take over. She stepped on the accelerator, begging the car to get her out and away as quickly as possible. But her growing unease was to prove justified when, minutes later, speeding along a deserted and apparently endless country lane, the engine had cut out. At first she couldn't believe it had happened. It was like something out of a horror film, but it most certainly had happened, and now raw fear gripped her tightly. Desperately she tried to restart the engine, her fingers twisting the ignition key frantically, but, try as she might, she could coax no life whatsoever from the engine. It was dead. 10 minutes later, a long 10 minutes of panic and desperation, Jane was beginning to hope that she would die. She told herself that anything was better than having to spend the night in the car, and she was becoming more and more terrified by the second. Her fingers were tired and aching from her frenzied attempts to bring the car back to life, but it had been no use, and the response from the engine had only grown worse until by the end it could only manage an intermittent clicking. And so Jane had had to resign, whether she liked it or not, to the fact that the car would take her nowhere tonight. 1 hour passed, 1 hour that seemed like an eternity to Jane, and during that eternity many thoughts and ideas flashed through her mind. She had contemplated getting out of the car and walking away, the direction determined by the toss of a coin, but she soon rejected that idea as being extremely unwise and probably suicidal. And all the time her hysteria grew. She wasn't particularly claustrophobic, but it was the idea that she attracted attention, that she stuck out like a sore thumb, which filled her with foreboding and fear. She couldn't be found. She locked all the doors, made sure every window was properly closed, whilst all the time expecting some horrible face to suddenly appear at the windows. Likewise, she was reluctant to glance into the mirrors in case her gaze fell upon similar horrors, and she was frightened to close her eyes in case a hand smashed through the windscreen to grab her. Eventually, she realized that the only thing she could do: climb into the back seat where she could lie down, close her eyes and try to sleep. This would be easier said than done, but she had to try. She could snatch a few hours' sleep, then wake at first light and get everything sorted out. Being early June, it would be light in a couple of hours, and she wouldn't hesitate to venture outside then. It was only the dark that caused the problem. And so, unclipping her seatbelt, she pushed herself through the gap between the two front seats. Failing to notice, however, that as she did so, the blanket in the passenger seat slipped down. And there she lay, curled up on the back seat, gazing up at the roof of the car. The half-moon lit up the night considerably, illuminating the interior of the car, and Jane's now accustomed eyes could make out every detail quite clearly, almost as clearly as in daylight. The trees outside through the windows, wavering only slightly in the still summer night. At least she wasn't cold. She tried to close her eyes and blank everything out in the hope of falling asleep for those few torturous hours before daybreak, but involuntarily, it seemed, her eyes kept opening. She gazed up at the windows, visualizing the face appearing, waiting for the arm to smash through, and even when she managed to close her eyes, she was listening intently, listening for the slightest sound. Her body convulsed as the shrilling sound ripped through her senses. She pushed herself harder into the seat, then in the next instant she realized that the sound was the shrill of a ringing telephone. Her mobile, of course! Jane jerked herself up, cursing for not thinking about it before. It had even crossed her mind. Without thinking twice, she eased between the front seats, snatched up the phone from the dashboard, thumbed the talk button, and brought it to her ear. "I'm coming for you, Jane. Now!" Her scream was the sound that filled the car now, and she threw the receiver down. Jane jerked awake from the nightmare, sweat beading her forehead, drenching her body. She looked up at the roof of the car and at the windows, her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. The nightmare had seemed so real. Everything was the same. Or almost, for there was one important difference. She hadn't brought her mobile with her. What with everything, that had been the last thing on her mind. It was still dark outside, and her wristwatch told her that it was 1:37. She had dozed for only a few terrible moments, and it seemed that even sleep couldn't take her away from the horror. Wanting to weep and resign to her fate, she tried to calm herself, convincing herself that sleep really was the lesser of evils. She had, after all, proved that she could fall asleep, and it wasn't certain that she would have another nightmare. But she would have to wake up at first light. That was important. She had to wake up and do what she had to do. It wasn't easy to relax, but she tried. And after 20 minutes of fear and apprehension, of tossing and turning, sleep finally took her away from it all. And this time it was a sound and peaceful sleep. Too sound. The jogger was out for his regular early morning run. It was his usual route. He only thought it slightly strange to see a car stopped in the country lane, though he did think it inconsiderate of the driver to leave it right in the middle and blocking the way instead of pulling it in to the side. As he got closer, he noticed that there didn't appear to be anyone in sight. He scanned around but saw no signs of anyone. There didn't appear to be anyone sitting inside the car either. As he drew nearer, he slowed down, curiosity now coaxing him to take a closer look. He told himself, with a smile, that if it were a courting couple, which it more than likely was, he would quickly continue straight past. He reached the car. There was a woman in the back seat, curled up, her eyes closed. But it wasn't this that had caused the jogger's eyes to widen. Wasn't this that had caused his already racing heart to pound even faster. It was the front passenger seat that had taken his attention, for there was something in it. Someone. A man. A dead man, that fact was blatantly obvious. He was slumped low in the seat so that his head was well down, the eyes agape, mouth wide, skin deathly white. A blanket covered him up to the chest, and the jogger assumed that it must have slipped down from covering the head. Just visible on the white shirt was an unmistakable red patch. Horrified at his discovery, the jogger flicked his eyes to the woman. Her eyes were closed, but her skin was pink and she was breathing. It didn't make sense. And then he noticed that the doors were locked from the inside. He could see all the buttons were pushed down. And as he leaned closer, he noticed something else. The keys were in the ignition. It took the jogger only a few moments before it hit him, before he realized that the only person who could have killed the man was the very same person who was inside the car with him. And then it hit him like a smack in the face. He didn't run at first. Not until, that is, he saw the woman stare in her sleep. A sleep that had lasted longer than Jane Macmillan had intended, preventing her from successfully disposing of her husband's body. And then he ran.